Thanks for continuing to tune into the channel and for continuing this debate on Molinism. My interlocutor's argument can be reduced to a few propositions. One, that the counterfactual creaturely freedom is true because Peter's exemplar has an A-oriented primitive disposition. Two, that disposition does not necessitate Peter's choice because Peter retains the power to do otherwise. And three, therefore, the CCF is grounded without destroying libertarian freedom. My objection that I have at this point to start off with is that I grant the first order modal distinction, but you've still not explained why Peter's exemplar has an A-oriented disposition rather than a non-A-oriented disposition, and that's the point where your answer still terminates. Your first point about the de dicto, de re distinction does not touch my actual objection, and this is an example of correct philosophy that does not touch the thesis. Your formula, which I have up here, is perfectly compatible with my objection, so let's explain this. You're saying it is necessarily the case that if Peter acts as an exemplar and C circumstance holds, well, the implication is A. Necessarily, if Peter is a modal exemplar and condition C is met, then action A is required. I agree that if Peter's exemplar has an A-directed disposition and C obtains, then A follows necessarily from those conditions. I have never denied that. In fact, I discussed this in the video that you were replying to most recently, and let me repeat what I said there. To say that necessarily if disposition toward A is constitutive of Peter's formal identity, then Peter would A and C is true only as a necessity of the consequence. But this is a trivial, analytic, conditional, nobody disputes. This tells me nothing about whether the antecedent obtains, and that, whether the identity in fact includes this feature and why, is not a necessity of the consequent. It's the whole contingent, unconditional claim in dispute. Your answer borrows the self-evidence that belongs to the trivial conditional, the necessity of the consequence, and quietly spins it on the substantive categorical claim that was never established. In other words, if Peter's essence necessarily includes disposition D, and D necessarily entails A under C, then necessarily if Peter has D and C obtains, A follows. But that does not establish necessarily that Peter has X, or has that D disposition. And a third time, just to make it very clear what I'm charging you with, you have established at most that if Peter's formal identity includes an A-directed disposition, then A follows from that disposition under C. But the disputed question is precisely why Peter's formal identity has that particular contingent disposition rather than its contrary. Even granting your formal identity language, you must distinguish that by which something is known or individuated from that by which it is made true. At best, formal identity identifies which possible complete biography counts as Peter's. Individuation is not truth-making. You owe me the second, truth-making, and have supplied at most the former, hexaity. Quoting Richard Mueller here from his Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms, I recommend that book highly. He says that the necessity of the consequence is a conditional or hypothetical necessity, best described as logical necessity standing in the order of knowing or speaking, or more simply, de dicto. Okay, this is what you're appealing to with your de dicto, de re distinction. On the other hand, and quoting Mueller again, the necessity of the consequent is the necessity that something that cannot be other than what it is, which is to say a simple or absolute necessity, in the order of being, a necessity de re, as opposed to a necessity de dicto of a statement. So de dicto versus de re does not solve the problem here. You are basically defending what follows from the fact that A is the disposition encoded in the exemplar. That's not controversial. I affirm that if Peter's formal identity includes an A-directed disposition, then A follows from that disposition under C. That reduces to if Peter would A, then Peter would A. Or if you would like, if Peter's formal constitution includes disposition D, then D explains his response under C. Fine. But why that disposition D rather than D prime? What makes it true that Peter's exemplar has the A-directed disposition rather than the non-A-directed disposition? Necessity of the conditional does not equal necessity of the antecedent. You have established the necessity of the consequence given the exemplar's A-oriented disposition. But the disputed proposition is precisely that the exemplar has that A-oriented disposition rather than its contrary. The necessity of the conditional does not establish the truth of the antecedent. Your invocation of scope fallacy doesn't help your case. Objection number 2 here. And again, your uncreated exemplar terminology is doing enormous work. When you state that, quote, I'm quoting here, the primitive dispositional profile constitutive of Peter's uncreated exemplar within the divine intellect, you need to distinguish three things there. One, Peter himself Peter himself is a created person who eventually exists. Two, there's God's idea and exemplar of Peter, an eternal act, an object of divine cognition. And three, the contingent counterfactual of creaturely freedom, Peter would A under C. You're moving from 2 to 3 without establishing the bridge. That is, you're moving from God's idea and exemplar of Peter as an eternal act and object of divine cognition, and you're moving to 3, the contingent counterfactual of creaturely freedom that Peter would A under C. You're moving between those without establishing the bridge. An exemplar can be uncreated in the sense that the divine idea is eternal and exists in God's intellect without the creature itself being uncreated. And as I stated over and over in my last video, what is the ontological status of the determinate A orientation within that divine idea? If it is simply part of God's necessary conceptualization, then you need to explain why it is contingent. If it is a contingent feature of the divine idea, then you need to explain what accounts for that contingency. If it is supplied by the creature, then you have returned to my aseity objection. So let us suppose that before the decree there are two possible exemplars that contain counterfactuals about Peter. E1, Peter would A under C. E2, Peter would non-A under C. Both of those exemplars preserve Peter's libertarian power to do otherwise. What makes exemplar 1 true rather than exemplar 2? There are four options. 1, Peter's necessary essence. Well, then exemplar 1 isn't contingent. 2, God's necessary essence. Well, then exemplar 1 isn't contingent. 3, God's will and decree. Then exemplar 1 belongs to free knowledge rather than pre-decretal middle knowledge. 4, a contingent primitive of Peter's agency. And that primitive is the ultimate ground of the counterfactual creaturely freedom and is not derived from God's essence or will. Your system chooses number 4 here. And that's not a logical contradiction, but it has very substantial theological consequences. Your own formulation concedes my central point. You state that, quote, the dispositional orientation is a contingent formal primitive of free secondary agency. So you're now explicitly saying the A orientation is contingent and the A orientation is primitive. Excellent. Then we agree that the determinate A orientation is not necessary to Peter's essence, and we agree that it is not supplied by God's decree. What then grounds this contingent primitive? You may say nothing further. That's what primitive means. Okay. Well, then the symmetrical dispositional grounding model that you're proposing, its ultimate truth maker for a counterfactual creaturely freedom is a contingent primitive of creaturely agency. And again, that's not a logical contradiction, but it has very substantial theological consequences. My aseity objection is not epistemic acquisition. It is the ontological source of determinate content. God knows counterfactual creaturely freedom 1 eternally. Okay, but why is CCF 1 true? Your answer is because Peter's exemplar has primitive A-directed self-specification. Then, why does Peter's exemplar have that contingent A-directed self-specification rather than the contrary? Your answer, that's simply the primitive nature of Peter's agency. Okay, then you have the crucial conclusion. The ultimate determinate source of this contingent truth is therefore neither God's necessary nature nor God's will. The problem is that God's eternal cognition contains determinate contingent content whose ultimate ground, according to your account, is not God. Let me state that again. The problem is that God's eternal cognition contains determinate contingent content whose ultimate ground, according to your account, is not God. Moving to objection 3. You state that an uncreated exemplar of a free agent is not a blank container that later receives a choice. Its dispositional orientation in C is part of its primitive formal identity as comprehended by God, just as fundamental physical properties or essential definitions serve as formal grounds without requiring an antecedent efficient cause. Formal grounding in divine conceptualism requires only formal intelligibility within the divine intellect, not prior temporal existence. I addressed this in the video you're responding to. The triangle example works because a triangle has 3 sides necessarily. The number 7 is prime necessarily. But Peter would confess under C, or Peter would A under C, is supposed to be contingent. You cannot simply appeal to the explanatory model of necessary formal properties to explain a contingent formal property without explaining where the contingency comes from. A necessary formal property needs no further explanation of why it is contingent rather than contrary because it isn't contingent. Let me say that again. You cannot simply appeal to the explanatory model of necessary formal properties to explain a contingent formal property without explaining where the contingency comes from. A necessary formal property needs no further explanation of why it is contingent rather than its contrary because it isn't contingent. Your problem begins precisely because you are claiming that the A orientation is both formally constitutive and contingently specified. You are sliding between power and counterfactual truth. And again, I proved this in the video you're responding to. You said Peter retains, the capability to do A and to not do A. Fine, but the capability of non-A, the possibility of inaction, that it is possible for Peter to not perform action A, does not entail counterfactual crucially freedom, non-A. Peter's having the power to choose non-A does not mean that if C, Peter would choose non-A. Let me state that again. Peter's having the power to choose non-A does not mean that if C, Peter would choose non-A. Likewise, having the power to choose A does not mean that if C, Peter would choose A. I continue to grant your de-re simultaneous potency, but that establishes only that A and non-A are genuinely possible exercises of Peter's power. It does not select one of those possibilities as the true counterfactual. And that is my very original could, would point. You keep answering could with would. So let's consider A. Peter's hexaity, that answers who is Peter. B. Peter's essential dispositional nature, that answers something like what kind of agent is Peter. And then C. Peter's determinate counterfactual behavior, that answers what would Peter freely do under C. You want A to B to C, to follow logically. Just because Peter, who he is, and then what kind of agent he is, you want to follow from that Peter's determinate counterfactual behavior. Who Peter is does not equal what Peter could do, does not equal what Peter would freely do. Does the exemplar contain merely the formal identity and powers of Peter, or does it contain the determinate contingent truth that Peter would choose A under C? If merely the former, middle knowledge hasn't been explained. Why does the exemplar contain A rather than non-A? And now we're back at the beginning. You state that God knows counterfactuals of crucially freedom entirely through himself because he comprehends Peter's exemplar. So my question is, does God comprehend the exemplar because, 1, he comprehends his own essence, or 2, does his comprehension of his own essence somehow determine which contingent counterfactual of crucially freedom obtains? If the former, 1, that when God comprehends the exemplar because he comprehends his own essence, how does necessary divine essence entail a contingent creaturely choice? If the latter, when God comprehends the exemplar because does his comprehension of his own essence somehow determine which contingent counterfactual obtains? If that's the case, the choice isn't really independent of God. To say this another way, does God's comprehension merely reveal an A orientation that is already fixed in the exemplar? If so, what fixed it? Divine conceptualism doesn't solve the problem I have posed, it merely relocates it. Divine conceptualism explains why God can know the exemplar without looking outside himself. It does not by itself explain why the exemplar has one contingent counterfactual specification rather than another. Okay, objection number 5 now. You've introduced another term. Your rhetorical complexity does not give an explanatory mechanism. And see my video where I discuss explanation versus redescription. Supercomprehension sounds like an additional explanatory mechanism, but what does it actually add to this conversation? It simply means that God comprehends Peter's exemplar exhaustively. Okay, but what makes the exemplar A-oriented rather than non-A-oriented? Supercomprehension doesn't answer that. It tells us how completely God knows it, not why the thing known has the determinate contingent content. Does the concept, in this case, supercomprehension, explain the disputed fact, or does it merely describe God's ability to know the disputed fact? Divine supercomprehension explains God's knowledge of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. Excuse me. Haxeity explains which individual is under consideration. Primitive agency explains that Peter is a genuine agent. Dispositional profile identifies the particular disposition. Counterfactual divine freedom describes God's conditional pre-volitional intention. And the matrix CCF, if and only if CDF, describes the relation between CCF and CDF. But none of these answers why Peter would A rather than non-A under C. At the heart of the matter, you have successfully answered a question that I am not asking. That is, how can Peter would A be necessarily implied by an A-oriented exemplar without making Peter's actual act necessary de re? Well, let me state that, because I think this is exactly what you are doing here. I'm going to copy and paste this from my notes, put it on the slide. Oops, that's pretty small. Let me blow that up a little bit bigger. At the heart of the matter, you have successfully answered a question that I am not asking. That is, how can Peter would A, that statement, be necessarily implied by an A-oriented exemplar without making Peter's actual act necessary de re? That's the question you're answering, and that's not what I'm going after. I agree that the necessity of the conditional does not entail the necessity of Peter's actual choice. But my question precedes that one. What makes the exemplar A-oriented rather than non-A-oriented in the first place? Your answer is that this orientation is a contingent primitive of Peter's agency. Well, if so, then we finally identified the ultimate ground of the counterfactual of creaturely freedom. It's not God's essence, it's not God's will, but a contingent primitive located in the creaturely exemplar. That's precisely the claim whose compatibility with divine aseity that I am now questioning. Your particular account of pre-decretal determinate counterfactuals of creaturely freedom requires a contingent truth whose ultimate ground is neither God's necessary nature nor God's will. Whether you call that primitive agency, formal identity, dispositional self-specification, or exemplaristic structure, all of that is secondary. The ontological question remains unchanged. Objection number 6. You say that God knows counterfactuals of creaturely freedom entirely through himself by supercomprehending the infinite imitability of his own essence in finite forms. Okay. Does God's knowledge of his essence entail the specific counterfactual of creaturely freedom? There's a huge difference between 1, God's essence is imitable in creatures, and 2, this particular possible creature under this particular condition would freely choose A rather than non-A. The first is precisely the kind of thing divine exemplarism can explain. The second is the Molinist would. Divine exemplarism can explain why God knows that Peter could be a rational creature capable of A or non-A, possessing a particular nature, etc. But it does not follow that God's knowledge of his own essence determines which contingent libertarian counterfactual is true of that creature. Your appeal to supercomprehension makes it sound as though sufficiently exhaustive knowledge of a possibility somehow generates its contingent counterfactual specification. Knowing everything there is to know about Peter's possible nature does not obviously entail knowing which libertarian choice Peter would make. You need a bridging principle, something like, given God's complete comprehension of Peter's exemplar, it follows that Peter would choose A under C. But why does that entailment hold? If the answer is 1, because A is part of Peter's primitive dispositional profile, then you've merely moved the unexplained counterfactual of creaturely freedom into the exemplar. If the answer is 2, because God's essence determines that profile, then you've lost the libertarian contingency. If the answer is 3, because CCF and CDF mutually constitute each other, then you've returned to my grounding objection. Your latest response hasn't really eliminated my dilemma. It has made the location of the primitive much clearer. All right, I'm going to take a drink of water here. Objection 7. Your system ultimately makes 2 claims that cannot simultaneously do the work you need them to do. On the one hand, the determinate counterfactual of creaturely freedom is contingently specified by creaturely agency rather than by God's will. And 2, the ground of that determinate counterfactual of creaturely freedom is entirely within God because it is contained in the divine exemplar and known scientia per essentiam. The problem is not simply that one is external and the other internal. The deeper problem is what is the source of the determinate content A rather than non-A. We must distinguish 3 propositions. Proposition 1, God knows the possibility of Peter choosing A or non-A. Proposition 2, God knows the determinate counterfactual of creaturely freedom. If C, Peter would choose A. Proposition 3, God knows P2, proposition 2, through himself. Proposition 1, that God knows the possibility of Peter choosing A or non-A, that's perfectly compatible with classical divine aseity and divine conceptualism. God's knowledge of Peter as a possible creature can be grounded entirely in God's knowledge of his own essence and its possible finite participations. Proposition 2 is the controversial step. Remember, Proposition 2 was God knows the determinate counterfactual creaturely freedom if C, Peter would choose A. What accounts for the transition from Proposition 1, Peter could do A or non-A, to Proposition 2, Peter would A under C? Your answers have appealed to Peter's primitive secondary agency, Peter's haxity, Peter's dispositional profile, the exemplar, the CCF-CDF matrix, God's super-comprehension of his own essence, but none of those by itself explains why A rather than non-A obtains. Ultimately, does the determinate content Peter would A rather than non-A originate in God's essence, or does it originate in the creaturely side of the model? If the A orientation of Peter originates in God's essence, then is God's essence sufficient to distinguish Peter would A from Peter would not A? If yes, then the distinction between the two counterfactuals of creaturely freedom is grounded in something necessary and divine. But now you have a problem for Molinism. If God's necessary essence is sufficient to make Peter would A under C true rather than Peter would non-A under C, then the truth of that counterfactual creaturely freedom is ultimately fixed by a necessary divine reality. And if the divine essence necessarily fixes that particular CCF, then it looks like natural knowledge, not middle knowledge. Very simply, if God's essence determines the truth value of the CCF, why is the CCF contingent rather than necessary? Your answer cannot simply be because Peter is free, because that's the very thing being explained. If the A orientation originates in Peter, which I think is what you are arguing, then my aseity objection returns, because before God's decree, Peter does not exist as an actual secondary cause. There is no actual Peter standing outside God whose agent causal power is generating a truth. You will respond that Peter's exemplar exists eternally in God's intellect, but that only relocates the question. What makes the exemplar have the determinate content Peter would A under C rather than Peter would non-A under C? What makes that? What determines that? What makes that true? If the answer is God's essence, you are back in horn 1 of the dilemma. If the answer is Peter's primitive agency, then you've placed a contingent determination that is not derived from God's will or God's necessary essence into God's eternal cognition. Calling it an exemplar doesn't solve that. This violates divine aseity. And let me sharpen the claim that God's cognition is conditioned by something outside himself, because you will answer that God isn't epistemically passive and he doesn't learn from Peter. Let's not get distracted by this. The point is about determinate cognitive content. My aseity objection is not that God temporally learns something from Peter. I grant that completely that he does not. My question is what accounts for the determinate content of God's eternal cognition. You say that God knows CCF1 entirely through himself, by super-comprehending his own essence. But you also say that CCF1 is contingently specified by Peter's primitive secondary agency, and that CCF2 could have been true instead. Those two claims need to be reconciled. If God's own essence is the sufficient ground of the determinate content A rather than non-A, why isn't that content necessary? If God's essence is not sufficient to determine A rather than non-A, what supplies that determination? If the answer is Peter's primitive agency, then the determinate content of God's eternal cognition is not exhausted by God's own essence. It has a source that is neither God's necessary nature nor God's free decree. And that's precisely the third source that the classical divine aseity rules out. Your SDG model appears to require a third source of determinate contingent truth, while classical divine aseity permits only two relevant sources for the content of divine knowledge, what is grounded in God's necessary nature and what is grounded in God's will. I am not claiming that every truth must be caused by God's will. I'm asking what ontologically grounds a contingent truth known by God prior to his decree. I am not demanding efficient causation. I'm asking what makes it true. So in sum, You say that God knows the counterfactual creaturely freedom entirely through himself because the determinate A orientation is contained in Peter's exemplar as a primitive feature of secondary agency. So I want to isolate one question. Is the determinate fact that Peter would choose A rather than non-A under C grounded sufficiently in God's necessary essence to explain why A is true? If yes, why is the counterfactual creaturely freedom contingent rather than necessary? If no, then what supplies the determinate A over non-A content? If you answer Peter's primitive agency, then what is the ontological status of that contingent specification prior to Peter's existence, and how can it be a source of determinate truth without introducing into God's eternal intellect something whose specification does not originate in God? Saying that God knows it through himself answers how God knows it, but it does not yet answer what makes the proposition true. Your responses become increasingly more sophisticated in explaining how God knows the CCF while leaving untouched what makes the CCF true. Leaving the discussion to terminate in Peter's disposition toward A, as eternally comprehended, may work to provide metaphysical grounding, but at a huge metaphysical cost of divine aseity. Making this move means that the determinate content of God's eternal cognition comes from Peter's primitive agency. Therefore, the determinate content of God's eternal cognition is not exhausted by God's own essence. What I am trying to show you is that I can sever the epistemic question from the ontological one so that God knows it through himself can no longer function as an answer. You continue to elaborate on the mechanism of divine cognition, supercomprehension, formal exemplar matrices, top-down relational structure. That seems like progression in our discussion each time you introduce more complex accounts of the epistemic question. I am showing you exactly what kind of answer you are giving me and that it is not responsive to the question at hand. How God knows is not what makes it true. Remember, my dilemma was, is the determinate fact that Peter would choose A rather than non-A under C grounded sufficiently in God's necessary essence to explain why A is true? If yes, why is the CCF contingent rather than necessary? If no, then what supplies the determinate A over non-A content? You have already said your system bites the bullet. You said, quote, SDG bites the bullet on the ultimate locus of contingency is indeed located in the creaturely agent's primitive self-specifying identity. Your system must bite the bullet again in conceding that the ultimate source of this determinate truth is not God, and it must give up divine aseity. With this move, we no longer disagree about what follows from your view. We disagree about whether that consequence is theologically acceptable. I am showing you that your SDG model doesn't avoid the aseity cost that classical Molinism has always carried. It relocates it under new terminology. We can diagram our argument under three main questions. There's question one, truth-making. Why is counterfactually creaturely freedom A true rather than CCF non-A? Question two, ontology. What is the ontological status of whatever makes CCF A true prior to creation? And then question three, aseity. How can that ground exist or have determinate specification independently of God's essence and will? Your attempt to answer one, the truth-making, by stating that the ground is Peter's primitive dispositional agency as eternally contained in God's exemplar. I think your system oscillates and equivocates on what Peter's primitive dispositional agency actually means at certain points, but you have located the terminus. You've not demonstrated that this terminus exists, nor explained how it can have the ontological status required by your theory, nor how it is consistent with divine aseity. You have identified your ultimate primitive, but you have not shown that this primitive is metaphysically coherent with classical divine aseity and libertarian contingency. You are familiar, no doubt, with Robert Adams' anti-Molinist argument. It's something along the lines of, if the truth of CCF is explanatorily prior to God's decree, and God's decree is prior to Peter's existence, and Peter's existence is prior to Peter's action, then the truth of the CCF seems explanatorily prior to Peter's own action. Okay, you are trying to escape the problems of coherency with divine aseity and libertarian contingency by saying that the CCF is grounded in Peter's primitive agency, but Peter's agency exists as an eternal exemplar in God's intellect. The question I have been getting at is, what is this Peter's agency prior to Peter? If it is an actual agentive power belonging to Peter, then Peter somehow has a determinate agentive feature prior to his existence. If it is merely God's idea of Peter, then the actuality of that idea belongs to God, and now you need to explain how a specifically contingent A over non-A determination gets into God's idea without being supplied either by God's necessary nature or God's will. Or if you don't want to use that phrase, get into, you need to explain how that CCF-A is determinate content in God's eternal cognition. That is, how can an uncreated contingent creaturely determination be eternally present as determinate content in God's simple necessary intellect without compromising divine aseity? We have arrived at the classical grounding problem, and your SDG proposal is an attempted solution to it. Your proposed solution is to make the determinate CCF an ultimate primitive of creaturely agency, eternally represented in God's exemplar. My objection is that this does not remove the grounding problem. It relocates the terminus to a primitive contingent specification whose ontological status and compatibility with divine aseity remain to be demonstrated. Thanks for watching.